So let's see. Where did we leave off last time?
I wasn't prepared for that.
Trying to think. We had. I think they just basically got over the river Styx, right? Through the to the first circle, like on the edge of the first circle.
Yes, I believe so.
And we were talking about like the hopelessness with the gates and the screaming that they were hearing.
Yes.
That.
So I believe we're jumping in Canto 4?
Yes. Also, I
Right.
just realized I forgot the most important part of the smoking the tobacco, so I need to go grab that. I'll be back in just a moment. All right. We're good now. Crisis averted. Bourbon, whiskey, tobacco this time. Nothing too fancy, but it's pretty good.
Sounds fancy.
They always make it sound fancy. I just got it from like a regular smoker shop, with all the other, you have to dig through the like vape pods and stuff to find the loose leaf tobacco. Yeah, so Canto 4. I also now have the actual book in front of me, where I didn't last time. Oh, I guess I haven't shown it on the video yet. Let me do that real quick. Got this copy from Barnes & Noble, I think. I don't know. They had this like limited run thing, which is pretty cool.
That's so sick.
All the illustrations in it and whatnot. It's got like an illustration probably every like 2 or 3 pages, maybe even more than that. There's so many. It helps when they were already done for you by like master painters and you just have to copy it in, but yeah, so Canto 4 is Limbo. I want to start talking about it, but I also want to have the book open while I do that, so I'm going to finish packing the pipe first, actually. Do you have any overall thoughts on this section, these 3, while we set up our pipes here?
Let's see. Limbo is what we're jumping into. So that's one of the notes for my book is they enter the first concentric ring of hell, that of limbo, the rim. Which is, it says, where dwell neither in joy nor in suffering. So it is hell, but it's
like
not
hell,
as
the free version.
Yes.
Yeah. Still doesn't sound very good.
No, it doesn't sound very good, but it's not. It's not as awful as everything else that follows it. So.
Right. Which I suppose is the type of standard you have to use when you're in hell.
Yeah. I think what was interesting about it is there were a lot of callbacks, I guess, to biblical narratives or lots of like imagery and symbolism from the Bible. It was, yeah, very, very interesting. Definitely had to look up a few things just to try to understand what he was saying.
Yeah.
Because he said a lot of, he called people by unique names.
Mm.
But yeah, so it seems like this is the first layer where you're separated from God. So that's obviously the worst. I mean,
The
that's
worst part of it.
hell, right? But it seems like it's just that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not separated from God, and there's more punishments that make it, are salting the wound. It's like that's just the first layer of you're just separated from. But you're like forever lost, I guess, right? That's kind of the idea, is always searching, never finding, which is in the Bible. That's that first separation.
Mm-hmm.
Torment of wandering, I guess.
Yeah, it seems I mean, we'll get there, but it seems almost especially cruel to have the like of Socrates and Plato in um, this ring of hell, because they were so carefully apprehending the nature of God and being so successful at it with no special revelation. And then it's like
Yeah.
they just got out. They just were born in the wrong time, I guess. I don't know. We'll get to that discussion a little bit because I kind of delved into that somewhat for this.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, that's definitely interesting too. The people and the types of people that he places in limbo they're very interesting.
yeah. The first note I have here is just the idea that it's interesting that Virgil here in line what is this, 2019, the anguish of the people who are below here in my face depicts that pity which for terror thou hast taken. So Dante thinks that he's afraid, but in fact he's just pitying these people, which he himself is a part of. But I think it's interesting that like in later cantos, Virgil will sort of chastise Dante for taking pity on the people there, whereas in this ring he himself takes pity on everybody that's there. And I don't know if that's as related to like just the fact that like this is where he is, or if it's because of the nature of why they're there. Because I
Yeah.
think it's interesting that Dante has so much pity for people later that are classified as sinners, whereas people here he doesn't like seem to have as much of a reaction. I guess maybe because their torment is like less obvious, but
Yeah.
anyway. And so
Yeah.
go ahead.
Another line that follows that one pretty nearly, in line, I think 24 or 5. He says, "As far as I could tell from listening here, there were no wails, but only sighs
Yeah.
that made a trembling in the everlasting air." So that's sort of the same thing that you're saying, right? Is like when he's there, all that he's seeing is not the sort of terror and horror and wails and screaming and gnashing that is all of hell.
Right.
But in this one, it's sort of like, yeah, it's like a faint torment. It's like the sighs, the disappointment, and the wandering.
Yeah. Yeah. That is. I had a note on that here. Yeah, it seems like it connects in my mind to the hopelessness thing that we talked about last time. It's on the gate and everything. Because it's like I'm trying to imagine the feeling that I would have if I was there, and it would be something. The closest I can come up with is something like regret. But the problem with characterizing it as regret is usually when you think of regret, it's like, oh, I could have done this, but instead I did this, and now I'm suffering the consequences. Whereas this is more like it just happened to you. You happened to be born in the time without Christ, or you happened to be born in a place where the gospel hadn't yet been shared, or whatever it happens to be. Like, so it's almost like regret, but you could never have changed the outcome.
Yeah.
which seems to me to be about as hopeless as it gets. There's not even hope in the past. Even if you could go
Yeah.
back, it wouldn't be different.
Yeah. I think he also put all unbaptized infants, men and women who lived virtuously, but who lacked the true faith. Um, I think he even put Christians in limbo that like didn't live out their faith, or like it wasn't realized, like it wasn't actual. Um,
Yeah, that's interesting. What is that line?
I'm trying to see. It's almost I guess like the ring of indifference, or I think it's 37 through 40.
37. And if they were before Christianity in the right manner, they adored not God. And among such as these I am myself. For such defects and not for other guilt, lost are we, and are only so far punished, that without hope we live on in desire.
And also 33, line 33.
Uh, Mine says, "Now will I have thee know, ere thou go further, that they sinned not, and if they merit had, 'tis not enough, because they had not baptism."
Yeah, so mine says they did not sin. If they had merits, these were not enough. Baptism they did not have. The one gate of faith the one gate to the faith which you believe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that means that there are Christians that didn't live out their faith here or not. I wonder if that would be considered a sin. Because what's interesting here is it says they sinned not, and I don't know if we're supposed to interpret that as like they didn't sin at all, or that they were repentant for their sin. And if it's interesting to think of repentance being like useful for eternal purposes, like without Christ, because like the whole point of repentance framed within the context of Jesus is that repentance is the key to forgiveness. Well, Jesus' sacrifice is the key to forgiveness, but in accepting that gift, repentance is necessary. Whereas before that, I mean, I guess I guess it's just repentance, and there's no like exchange of repentance for forgiveness.
Mhm.
Although there is that
It
one
also
story with David, right, where he like kills Uriah, and he doesn't like make any sacrifices or anything. He just asks for forgiveness, and God kind of gives it to him, which is a weird passage in the Old Testament.
Mhm. Yeah.
Probably no.
The line right after that too. For such a falling short, and for no crime, we all are lost, and suffer only this. Hopeless, we live forever in desire.
Yeah, yeah, that life without hope. There's no like going back or going forward that can change it.
Yeah. Very interesting.
There's well, so this sort of brings us up to the question of like predestination and election and how all of that works, because there's a lot of talk about that what happens to people in the past before Jesus? Do they get saved? And it seems like Dante thinks some of them do,
Yeah.
but it's not super clear why they get an exception, other than that they're like the head honchos, in the Old Testament. That he goes through here in line, starting in line 55. He goes through Adam, Abel, Noah, Moses, Abraham, David, Israel, Rachel. There's like a bunch of other Old Testament figures that you would think would be on that list that aren't, but it might just be because it's poetic and he's leaving them out just because.
Yeah.
But he also says here in line 61, and others many, and he made them blessed. And so this others many, is that meant to imply other righteous Jews and not like Romans, like people like Virgil or whatnot? Because you would think the way that Virgil's functioning here, that he would be among the people surely that would be able to be made blessed by Jesus coming into hell.
But why does he say that some of the philosophers are there, right? That's a sort of different, they're there for a different reason.
Are they? Let's skip ahead a little bit. I might not have cottoned on to that. Where is that? Let's see. Here we go. Line, looks like it starts with line 134, maybe.
Let's see. One he said in line like 131, I think it's I saw the master of all those who know, which is Aristotle.
Yeah. All gaze
Which is that's an interesting way to talk about Aristotle. I guess maybe just sort of,
yeah.
He admires his knowledge.
Well, because Thomas Aquinas uses him as he calls him the great philosopher, right, or something like that in the Summa.
Yeah.
I think probably at this time, I remember reading that there were fewer works. We have a lot of Plato's stuff now, but like maybe they didn't have as much from him there. And so Aristotle is kind of the main guy. Aristotle also had all of the he had a much more foundational treatment, I guess, of logic and stuff. Where Thomas Aquinas is up here with theology, and oftentimes Socrates and Plato are talking about application and stuff. Whereas, I think Aristotle's kind of the groundwork, right? I remember reading his a couple of his treatises. One of them on basically it was talking about grammar and how things in sentences mean things.
Oh yeah.
And how to think through what somebody's saying at the most granular level possible. I maybe that's why he's calling him that, just because he's kind of his writing is sort of the basis of all of that.
Yeah.
But as far as them being there for a different reason, was there a line you were thinking about for that? I don't know.
No, I guess I assumed that they were there partially for questioning maybe the authority of a god or all the gods. And so it seemed to me that they were there for that, for the sort of uncertainty they may have caused people or they may have participated in. Just being the nature of philosophy is asking questions, kind of, So maybe I assumed that that's why they were there, whereas it doesn't feel like that's the reason that, unbaptized infants are there or Christians who were lukewarm were there. They seem like they have different reasons.
Yeah, I wonder. Well, they all definitely lack baptism, which seems to be the reason that Virgil explicitly gives. For maybe he's not referring to the philosophers, but I thought kind of he was talking about just the general why anybody's in limbo. But I wonder if there is kind of another layer to it that I might have missed in my reading. But I don't see him explicitly say that, but you could be right that there's another part of it. One thing that's interesting, and I don't know if this weighs in on this discussion at all, but he mentions Saladin as one of the people that's here. And Saladin is the Sultan of Egypt. He's a Muslim. And he is after, well after Jesus. So unlike Socrates and Plato, who would not have had an opportunity to be baptized, because they were before Christ's time. Saladin certainly has been around past then, but maybe the idea is that he just doesn't. Well, I guess you could look at it two ways. I guess you could look at it, he's committed that same sin, causing confusion, like you're saying, or just that he was raised in a part of the world that didn't have baptism as an accessible rite.
Hmm.
So I don't know how we're meant to take that exactly. But it is interesting that he puts a Muslim alongside the likes of Socrates and Plato, which strikes me as uh, unusual maybe for like a medieval piece, medieval European text.
Yeah, that is interesting. Because then that almost makes you think that he's grouping in people who are religious almost by nature, but or don't have they're missing something, you know.
Right. Right. Well, certainly the
Hmm.
teaching of the Catholic Church was at the time and still is that baptism is necessary to salvation as far as at least in the normative case. And that maybe there are exceptions to that, but we don't really know about them if there are. So I imagine that this is what that teaching is kind of what this chapter is reflecting. Because like you said,
Yeah.
it puts infants here, um, unbaptized infants here, as well as these philosophers and such. Certainly what they have in common is that they're not baptized, but yeah, like you said, maybe there's another layer to why the philosophers are here.
Hmm. Interesting. So after we've kind of recapped all of this, all of Canto 4 and Limbo, do you have any thoughts about Limbo before we move on?
I do. I have a few things written down here. Oh, so one thing I wanted to mention that I found interesting was obviously all of this that we're talking about brings up the question of like, is it just to condemn people who really didn't have an opportunity to accept Christ to hell? And that's a question that probably comes up a lot in modern discourse about Christianity.
Yeah.
And Dante sort of touches on that here, but he doesn't like go into it. But after a little bit of research, he does go into it way later in Canto 19 of Paradiso. And he's talking to like,
We're really far
yeah,
from
we're
that.
really far away from that. But he brings it back up. He's talking to an eagle, which from what I understand represents the Trinity somehow. I don't know. We'll get into all the weeds of that once we get there. But um he asks this question basically. I think he brings up specifically the case of like some kid in the Indies who's never met anybody Christian in his life and has no way of knowing the gospel. Like, how is it just that he's in hell? And of course, Dante's seen it, so presumably we're supposed to trust that he is indeed in hell. Um, but unfortunately, I was hoping for like some kind of crazy commentary that I'd never thought of before. Unfortunately, for me, it's kind of just what I've come to call the Job answer, which is to say, you don't know everything, so just kind of deal with it.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure there's a depth of profundity to that answer that I have not yet grasped, despite having spent a considerable amount of time meditating on it. Um, it has not satisfied me yet, but I don't know if it's really meant to satisfy me. Maybe I'm looking for the wrong thing from it. But yeah, so Dante does kind of deal with it later, but he just sort of says that, well, it's not really for us to know or judge, so just
Yeah.
deal with it, I guess.
Yeah. Just as unsettling as it always is.
Yes, precisely as unsettling as it always is. Yeah, I was definitely hoping that the Divine Comedy was going to have something more for me than that, but unfortunately, that's not the case in this particular instance. But anyway, I just thought that was interesting to bring up. As far as
Yeah.
overall thoughts on Limbo, I mean, I guess that's sort of the primary one, right? Like, these people are in hell and they didn't really have a chance of being anywhere else. Like, these are probably the people that are most likely to go to heaven, probably more likely than people who are in heaven right now, given their virtue and such. but they ended up in hell kind of from a chronological error.
Yeah.
And I don't really know what to make of that. I mean, it doesn't sound that bad compared to other parts of hell, and it's definitely based on like the Greek concept of Elysium. You sort of see that at like this castle or whatever it is that the philosophers are at. It's kind of a separate space for people that lived well. But and then even greater honors for people that lived very well, and how he mentions that in uh one of the lines here. I don't remember where. I thought I had written it down. But anyway, he says something about it doing the fact that their names are done honor in life gives them some level of honor here in hell, which is definitely a very Greek idea of like Hades.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem that bad, but it definitely doesn't seem good. Like the eternal desire is tough for me to grasp. And there's one idea that I had on that I want to talk about, but I'm gonna kick it back to you real quick just for any comments on that before I go in.
Yeah. I guess one thing we could see if one thing we've talked about before, I guess, is it seems that you are given over to the sin, right? That seems to be what hell is. Like you're given over to desire, to lust, and then it's allowed to consume you eternally, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about that in the next one for sure. I found, though, for ease of reference, I found that in my research that is called contrapasso in the context of Dante, if we want to use a fancy word for it.
Contrapasso?
Yes. Which means it's an Italian term based on the Latin phrase meaning like in accordance with or something like that. I can't remember.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah. It does seem, though, or I don't know, it could look like that the same is true of limbo, that those who are tortured with wandering on earth or have chosen to like pursue this maybe desire of knowledge or wisdom or whatever are just given over to eternal desiring or looking or searching, which is kind of the nature of philosophy. So if you were to make philosophy God or pursue it exclusively, right, of just constantly searching, then maybe that's what they're given over to here.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Because you've also talked about your thoughts on babies being sinful in their nature as well as like constantly desiring.
Yeah,
for selfish gain. So that would still fit in that category as well.
I was gonna say it might be hard to put infants in that category, but I see, that does kind of work itself together. Certainly, like Saint Augustine's conception of infants, or at least himself as an infant, kind of does seem to fit there.
And the same you could say of maybe other religious leaders or other people who are religious, but for selfish reasons, maybe, or they're sort of indifferent about good. They just want to participate in maybe religion. Maybe that's why you put some Christians in there as well.
So do you think that Dante might think that there are people who didn't have access to baptism or Christ that are in heaven and they just didn't commit this sin of like indifference or whatever?
Doesn't seem like he would think that.
Yeah. Well, given the whole like Paradiso exchange, it doesn't seem like that, but
or the one line here where it said like, though they have done nothing, they just weren't baptized. That one would seem to cross that.
Yeah. And I wonder if, because you're right, as an observation, it does seem to kind of fit the punishment does sort of fit like the type of life they led. But should we conceive of the type of life they led as like a choice, or just as something like they just never quite managed to find it, right? Because clearly, like if you read, I think Euthyphro is a great example with Socrates. If you read that dialogue, it's super clear that Socrates is in pursuit of something like the Christian answer to like what the divine is, because he gets like by the end of it, you've got this Greek philosopher talking about a monotheistic God that is the personification of all that is good, and now you're like way away from Greek polytheism, but he clearly didn't have any special revelation, no Old Testament, no New Testament, none of that, and he still got there. So it's like, it's hard to imagine doing much better than that. You know,
Yeah.
it's hard to imagine that being able to improve, like, beyond that, you know, without Christ.
Well, it seems like Dante would be like, well, he has a special place in hell.
Yeah, it does seem like that. It does seem like that. And maybe that is the case. I just don't know. I would like for it not to be. Let me throw that out there.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to read the last lines of Canto 4 before we jump into 5.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
I might have had... Oh, actually, hold on. Before we do that, can I go back to something about... We were talking about the fact they're like cursed to like desire forever, like to be like be searching forever.
Yeah, let's do it.
One thing that I thought about that, I had this past summer, I took a course in C.S. Lewis and read a lot of his work. And he has one book called Surprised by Joy, I think, is the one that I'm thinking of. And in it, he talks about joy as sort of like that the closest we get to joy, or maybe what actually is joy, is a rightly ordered desire. He gives us these like three instances in his life when he thought that he experienced joy, and they were all like instances of longing. Like he was describing this one time where he read a book as a kid, and it was all like winter themed and stuff, and he was just struck by this like desire to understand or interact with like the north, as much of that idea as you can get, like all that comes with that, the winter idea, the like sort of, for him it would be like the Norse context of it, and this sort of like informed how he was later. But it was like this desire kind of like came to him, and it was like overbearing, and he kind of enjoyed having the desire but couldn't get any further with it, and then it slowly just sort of slipped away from him, and he's only gotten like face approximations of that
Yeah.
going forward. And he gives a couple of other examples that I don't remember, but that's the one that stuck out to me, because it kind of resonated with certain experiences that I've had. And so I wonder if, I mean, obviously Dante wouldn't have had C.S. Lewis to fuel his reflections, but just kind of combining the two ideas together, sort of in C.S. Lewis's definition, then, is being cursed to eternal desire in a way a form of eternal joy, but like unfulfilled. Because I guess the idea is that maybe when we get to heaven, that's going to be resolved. But if you're looking at it properly, I don't know. I don't know if I'm articulating this right, but I've found times in my life where I have been an example for me that's sort of similar is I remember coming home, and I stopped at the end of the driveway to like get the mail, and it was like super dark, super clear night, and like right above me, pretty much right above where I'm sitting here, framed, like there's a lot of trees around me, framed right in the middle of the trees is the constellation of Orion. And it was like super clear, and for whatever reason it just stood out to me, and I just stood there for like probably 10 minutes just like staring at it and thinking about all of the stuff that comes with it, you know, like the Greek background and history and myth that goes with that, and then like the idea of people using the stars to navigate, and I don't know, all these elements in the ethos, I guess you would say, of Orion like came to me, and I found that like that experience was really good, but it also kind of left me unfulfilled, and it was very motivating. Like I ended up reading the Iliad as a result of that. I ended up doing like a lot of research and writing as a result of that, which clearly that happened for C.S. Lewis too. So I wonder And maybe that's only good in the context of having a hope that maybe one day I can have the fulfillment of that, whereas here these people don't. But I thought that was just an interesting like parallel that came to me because of my recent reading of
Yeah.
Lewis.
Yeah. It seems like like there are parts of searching and looking and desiring that are like moderately fulfilling on the way. Like, so you find a piece of information and you find a little bit more and then you ask more questions, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
This sort of seems like it would be the sort a longing, searching, desiring that's never ever like satisfied, right? So it's like you never get small pieces along the way. You never get peace of mind or clarity on any given topic. It would just be the sort of devoid of that. Like the things that you like about it wouldn't be there, it seems like, right?
Like it's
So
more
it would,
like, so you would think it's more dissatisfying than just thinking about things here on Earth.
yeah, I mean, you know, have you ever wondered or looked or searched for something and it was a little anxious or like aggravating that you weren't making any headway on a given topic?
Yeah.
I would think it would be more like that, but eternally. Like
Mm-hmm.
you're just never able to crack that next piece. You're just constantly just like in a headspace of you can't shake it. You're just wandering,
Yeah.
which isn't satisfying. It's sort
No.
of horrible. It's the only part that's bad about it, right?
Right. Right. It's like taking all the parts that sound like joy out of C.S. Lewis's idea of joy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know about that. It's hard to tell exactly. Well, and it's important to remember that this is all poetic, which isn't to say that
Mm-hmm.
it's unreliable or anything. But I'm just saying, like, it's hard to know exactly what Dante meant by this. Like, maybe he meant what you're saying, or maybe he meant that it was just kind of a similar state that they were in to Earth, but that they were in on Earth, but they're just never going to get Jesus to kind of come and tie it all up for them. I don't know. I don't feel as bad about it if it's the latter of the two.
Yeah.
But it's hell, so maybe I'm supposed to.
Yeah. And I think that's kind of what comes in the next few cantos too. Is like it's that some of them are sort of sad to read. Like I just didn't feel good about some of them, you know.
Yeah. Well, clearly
No,
Dante doesn't either.
yeah, what gave that away? The passing out.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll get there.
All right. Yeah, so I'm going to read this last few lines before we jump into Canto 5. Sound good?
Sure, let's do it.
All right. The company of 6 is cut by 2, and my wise guide leads me another way, out of the quiet, into the trembling air, into a place where nothing ever shines. So they're descending a little deeper.
Yeah.
Canto 5. And mine has some notes above the chapter, like before it gets into the actual verse. And it says, now the poets descend into the realm of the damned. So
So is
that
limbo
adds,
not? Do they mean? Is that what they mean? Limbo's not the realm of the damned. Do they mean that limbo is like not the realm of the damned?
I don't know, because he didn't write that,
Yeah,
right? That's the
Dante didn't
note.
write that, of course. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So, but it does make you wonder, like, because even the last thing he does say in Canto 4, which is one of the reasons I wanted to read it, is, into the trembling air, into a place where nothing ever shines. So there was, if you follow that logic, then there was at least some shining before that.
Sure, sure. Well, he has the fire, right? There's uh not very far away. This is line 67 looks like. Not very far as yet our way had gone, this side the summit, when I saw a fire that overcame a hemisphere of darkness. We were a little distant from it still, but not so far that I in part discerned not the honorable people held that place. So
Yeah.
there's something there.
Yeah. And then the first few lines of 5 are talking about like it's very dark and very creepy and very much more like hell than limbo
When
is,
limbo
right?
feels
Like the
like, yeah.
things are souls in agony and nothing ever shines and they're descending deeper and there's it's just much more visceral than Limbo was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very interesting.
for sure. I also wonder, what does he mean by? Hold on. I didn't. I just noticed this. This isn't in my notes or anything. But the sixfold company in two divides. Oh, I guess maybe he doesn't mean like divided by two evenly. Just we separated. I was wondering, like, is there a third person with them that I missed? But I don't think so.
No, it's the company that they're walking with the philosopher,
Right.
and then it's
And then
divided.
they just split up. Yeah, that's all that means. Okay. Oh, speaking of, just we would be remiss if we didn't mention the amusing fact that Dante puts himself with the poets, like the greatest poets of all time, which is just
Yeah.
funny. It's funny that he did that before he finished writing this, right? Like he puts himself in there, and like from what I understand, previous to the Divine Comedy, Dante's mostly been a like love poetry. I've seen it described almost as like Renaissance smut kind of writing that is like low and kind of not seen as like super, high art. And Dante sort of seems to criticize himself in that regard a couple times throughout here, which we'll get into. But it's just interesting. I don't know. It's funny that he puts himself there. I wonder if it's just a joke or if it is actually just some level of
he
perhaps.
just knew he was writing a banger.
Yeah, he knew he was
This one's
cooking.
gonna pop off. I can feel it.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. I mean, he was right. So who am I to naysay him? Here we are reading it. What is this? Almost 600 years later or something.
Yeah, man. All right. So the first thing that he runs into is they descend and then they meet Mike.
Yeah. Minus is an interesting character to put here.
Yeah.
I mean, well, it's not surprising in that I don't know if you've ever read or are familiar with the Aeneid, which Virgil wrote. But they go into Hades at one point in that, and Minos determines whether you go to like Elysium or into Tartarus, where like, the good or the bad, basically. But it's just weird that he would be here because I think of him as like a symbol of greed, because of the myth that we're always told about him, where everything he touches turns to gold and it ruins his life and stuff.
That's Midas.
Oh, Midas, you're right. I was totally confused about that. Minos
Yeah.
is a totally different figure. You're right.
Yep. Yeah. So Midas, he's the Minotaur.
Yeah, the
In the main.
Minoan king. Yeah, in Crete. Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, the way he talks about him is very, very interesting. He calls him the sin connoisseur.
Oh, is that what it says in yours?
Yeah.
What line is that?
That is line, I think it's 8.
That's the
Yeah,
go ahead.
he calls him the one born in evil. Wait, let's see. Horrible Minus grunts there like a bull, weighs all the sins, and sends the wicked down according to how far he winds his tail. I mean that when one born in evil hour appears before him, he confesses all, and then Judge Minus, the sin connoisseur, discerns place in hell is fit for him.
Yeah, that's crazy. So I have the older, like the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow translation. It's similar though. That's just a funny way to put it. It says, "I say that when the spirit evil born cometh before him, wholly it confesses, and this discriminator of transgressions seeth what place in hell is meet for it."
Mm-hmm.
I like sin connoisseur though. That's pretty good.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It struck me as this kind of like terrible version of the Sorting Hat in Harry Potter. Just deciding where you're gonna spend the next however long.
Yeah.
It's funny.
Mm-hmm.
The whole image of him like wrapping his tail around his body. I didn't know that the king of I don't know if in the Minotaur story the king has like a snake tail. I don't remember that, but could be just wrong, or maybe Dante added it.
Yeah.
There's a pretty crazy picture of him here, though. He looks huge. I'll put it up here.
Oh, dang.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. He's huge.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just a
Alleged.
perspective thing. Allegedly, that's right. Actually, it's weird because everybody in all of these pictures is like pretty built.
Yeah, dude, they're yoked.
Once we get into like the gluttony one, it gets a little confusing. Because there's like the one guy. I'll just show it right now since we're talking about it. This Caccio, or I can't remember what they call him. We'll get to it. But like that's the one they talk to. That's like the gluttony guy that he talks to about politics. But he looks
Yeah.
pretty built, dude. All the gluttony people. Anyway, that's just a
Yeah.
characteristic of the art. That has nothing to do with Dante. But I thought it was funny. Anyway. Yeah, connoisseur of sin. It's good. That's a good line.
Yeah. And then he warns them going into, which is really interesting.
Yeah. Oh, yes, this is a super interesting line. So you were talking about biblical imagery.
Yeah.
He says, let not the portal's amplitude deceive me, or deceive you, which I have the scripture here pulled up. It just reminded me of the, enter ye in at the straight gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in threat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it.
Yeah. So I think obviously this has like the biblical connotations.
Surely.
But it also calls back to sort of what we were talking about of when he's in the forest before he begins his journey.
Mm-hmm.
And he's only got like sin before him, right? Or he's like in the thralls of darkness.
Sure.
So it almost seems like Minos is talking, being that Minos is the judge here, is warning him about that almost, because mine translates a little differently, and I think it's worth reading because it says, beware, watch how you enter and in whom you trust. Don't be fooled by the broad and easy gate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is the same thing, but it sounds even more like something you'd read in
like
the Bible.
the Bible thing.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. No, that is interesting. Do not be fooled. Let not the amplitude deceive thee.
Watch how you enter and in whom you trust. I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, look how thou enterest and in whom thou trustest. And it's interesting, so like, yeah, you gotta wonder, so this character, like, why is he saying that? Is that because, so does he must recognize that there's something different about Dante than to the other spirits that he typically judges? Because he doesn't seem to be trying to, like, put him into one of the circles or anything.
Yeah. Well, in Dante's guide, gets onto him.
Right.
He's like, you shall not bar him, for he comes by fate. No questions. Only know that this is willed, where power is power, to do whatever it will.
Yeah, that was a crazy line. I have a lot of notes on that one, actually.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, so the biggest thing that stood out to me, well, that's just a crazy way to describe heaven, I think, assuming that that's what he's describing.
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody describe it like that before, but I think given our reflections so far, it really does make sense. It reminded me of Romans 7:15, in which Paul says, "For that which I do, I don't allow. For what I would do, that well, hold on, I've got this all mixed up. For what I would, that do I not. But what I hate, that do I." He's basically saying, like, I don't have the power to make what I want happen, because instead I do what I don't want to happen. And it's like this whole idea of like how sin takes you over, right? Like you have a good will. It kind of reminds me of like Freud's conception of like the id and ego kind of battling against each other, and the flesh is sort of represented by the id. It's like the ego knows what should be done, and then but something about our sinful nature makes it so that we end up not doing what we would actually want to do given the power. And so that's interesting here then, that he characterizes heaven as the place where there is power to do that which is willed. Mm-hmm. Sort of like the opposite of what we face here.
Yeah. Very cool.
Very cool. And it also kind of reflects with the hopelessness aspect that we were talking about back when he entered the first gate. Because to me, like, probably a pretty good definition of hopelessness is the inability to do anything that you will. Like, if there's no chance that what you want to happen comes about, that's about as hopeless as it gets, I feel like.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, that was what I had written down. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that further.
No, I just thought it was a bar for sure.
It is definitely a bar.
I think it's interesting that is the like extent of the conversation they have with Minus, because
Right.
they just kind of go, they're not getting judged, right? So they don't have to stand there and testify before him. They just kind of go past him into the next part, which is definitely the bulk of what we'll talk about.
Sure.
But no, I think it's interesting too, because we had talked about the idea of, and it was just an idea of like hell being perfected in its function, right? So all the beings that are there are doing what they're supposed to do.
Sure.
They're not frivolously sinning down there. They're like
Yeah.
they have, right. They're doing things that they've been told to do, right. And so it's interesting that sometimes they interact with these beings that aren't damned to be there. They're supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And this specific interaction is one of them. It's one of the first ones where they interact with a being who's supposed to be there. He's the judge of the sins, and he decides based on merit where you go, and you have to get sent so far down past certain levels and stuff.
It's super interesting that person that is supposed to be there, that's like put at that post, is like a historical figure to some extent.
Yeah.
Like Minos is theoretically somebody that existed as king of the Minoan kingdom. And, whether however much you believe of the Minotaur myth is kind of a separate issue, but it's just interesting that Dante would construe God as taking a person out of history and using him as the worker of hell, like one of the
But he's more than just a person out of history, right? He's also a legend.
right.
He's like he's so much more than that. But it is interesting that you'd say that.
And I mean, obviously, we have to take it all with a certain grain of salt, like how much like Dante means this to be a literal construction of what it actually is like. And maybe he means it entirely literally. I don't know, but obviously, a lot of this is very inspired by Virgil's work in the Aeneid, because he goes through a pretty detailed description of Hades and what it's like.
Give me 1 second. I think it's about to start raining. I can hear it.
Oh, good. Yeah, I was just saying. Obviously, it's like obviously, it's very inspired by Virgil's work and former poets, especially Greek poets. So, I mean, however we take that is however we take it, but it's definitely worth noting, and we'll see that with Cerberus in the next canto too.
Yeah, definitely. Which is also an interesting character to throw in there. But.
Yeah, we'll talk about him, I'm sure.
So next they go to. So they sort of walk past him, right, and then they make their way into what really feels like the first circle of, I guess, the damn part of hell.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, so this one, I don't know how to start this, but it's Paulo and Francesca, right?
Yeah.
I guess lust is this is the first one we've come across.
Yep.
Which I assume that there's got to be some layers that maybe I haven't digested or understood yet as to why lust is the first that we run into. But it is interesting what they approach to. So they what they're walking up to before they interact with anybody in this area. What the way they describe the area is very significant. I'm sure you have notes on that because I do too. Like the whirling cyclone and this sort of.
I have a picture of it here as you talk.
That is very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Zoom in on.
That's not the image I painted in my head, but it's very close.
Yeah.
Mine's sort of more spread out, not like that, but like
Yeah.
yeah, it's horrible. The idea is horrible.
Pretty bad.
But yeah. But I think it suits the sin, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sort of being caught up in the whirlwind of right? Because that's how it's often described, like by anyone who struggled with the sin, but also just in pop culture and literature and
Oh yeah,
stuff, right?
that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, like the sin of lust is always being like kind of caught up in the fire of it, the whirling of it before you even catch it. It's just whoosh, like it's
Yeah.
that being taken with it, like an undertow or a hurricane or a tornado, right? It's
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting that he uses that imagery. They approach this cyclone that's just whirling,
Mm-hmm.
and we're there. So.
Yeah, here we are. And I think again, I again go to C.S. Lewis. It reminds me of him talking about. He talks about how hell is like where we choose to be if we go there.
Yeah.
And like the reason that we go to hell is because we live in a way that reflects hell because we want to. And I think this is such a perfect image for lust because I think if you stripped away whatever pleasure you get out of it, right, is sort of the last vestige of like God's goodness sort of involved in that, right? Like the pleasure itself isn't a bad thing, but like if you stripped that away, I'm pretty sure it would look exactly like this, like the feeling or experience of it. Like I don't know that it's any different really. Yeah. Yeah, it's it's interesting. I was talking about like desire earlier, being like part of joy, but it's not desire like this. Like it feels very different. That's why I kind of said a rightly ordered yearning, like where you're looking at things that are actually like beneficial. Not like getting caught up in baser passions, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think what another part of it that was interesting is like when I think of like that whirlwind, that rushing, like the sucking that's pulling you, that is also described. I think it's very characteristic of like sins, specifically of addictive sins, right? So it's that sort of fiending that pulls you and just takes. And I feel like that's also portrayed in the imagery here of like that whirlwind that's just constantly just pulling at you, just like they can't even like think or be. They're just being pulled in that whirlwind,
Right.
Tossed.
Yeah, exactly. I think he has a good line about it here. Here it is. 40 this is 37, I guess. It says, I understood that unto such a torment the carnal malefactors were condemned, who reason subjugate to appetite. That last line. Bars.
Ooh.
That's crazy.
But it's bone still at the same time, It's like
yeah. Oh, it hits right at the core of the issue. It really does. And it reminds me of like you mentioned, like undertow. That's kind of the image that I have. Like, because when you're in the water and you feel it, there's a point at which you can feel it starting to move you, and you can stop and like plant your feet or like go back. And
yeah.
I think,
But you still feel pulling,
yeah, you
And
still
that
feel the pull.
it's like, yeah.
But there's a point
But
at
if you
which
don't,
I think there's a point at which if you just keep going, you won't be able to stop anymore. Like there's a point of no return, basically. And I'm just still talking about the physical experience of like undertow and like a current and a tide. And but I think that's exactly analogous to what lust is. It's brilliant imagery, absolutely brilliant.
yeah, in that line, the same line in mine reads a little differently, but it's the same thing. It's for the damned who were wicked in the flesh, who made their reason subject to desire.
Yeah, made reason subject to desire. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You're like sacrificing the stability of standing up to just being taken away.
Yeah, because that's what sin is, and specifically any sin that's addictive is that way, right? It's like it could be reasoned away, but it's being suppressed by desire, right? It's like overriding that, and that's why people struggle to get out of addiction. Even really intelligent people, I've known some very intelligent people who struggle with addiction, and they can't get out of it
Yeah.
And that can be an addiction to all the rest of the sins as well, like gluttony too. I've known some very
Sure.
smart people who they couldn't get out of their own way. They couldn't reason it away. And in this, like how we've talked about, I forget that big fancy word you just used about being turned over to your sin, but that is this, right? It's finally there's like you said, there's no going back at this point. It's just completely turned over to the desire. It's just sweeping you eternally forever.
Yeah, you would be hard pressed to find somebody, I think, who struggles with the sin of lust that, when like questioned in a like sterile environment, would say that it was like a good thing or like that it like made sense. You know, I don't think you would find anybody. Well, no, you would find some people nowadays, but I think out of people that you would just like encounter on a daily basis, I don't think you would often find people who are not cognizant of the fact that that's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And that seems to be the case with the characters we meet here, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, so the most of the rest of this, beyond what we've talked, he gives a few examples of like people throughout history and myth and such that are here. Um, but it ends with the story of Francesca and her, was he a brother-in-law or something? I don't remember. Something not good. And they're together uh, in because they tell the story of how like they read the poetry about Lancelot, I think it was.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're sort of seduced into uh what's the word? Adultery, and
Yeah.
like a very bad kind of adultery, because it's not quite incest. I don't think they're like related, but I think they're related by marriage, which is not good.
No.
Not good for either of them or
Nope.
anybody they're with. So that's the story that we have, and so most of the rest of this, I don't have as much notes on specific lines because she's just sort of telling the story. But yeah, general thoughts on that story.
Sorry, I did have a few notes online. That's why I was checking to see if I wrote anything.
Yeah, go ahead.
Let's see. Nah, I mean, I have some notes. I have one that we'll kind of talk about towards the end because I think it's got some, not foreshadowing, but it's not really about this, so we can do that one later. No. Okay. But this is one of the first ones, one of the first punishments in hell, I think, where it's fitting, but it's still things are starting to seem harsh, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of melancholy of limbo. It's a sort of like torment eternally, which when you put it into perspective is like, it's rough. It's just really rough.
Yeah. Dante certainly agrees. At least Dante the character,
Yeah.
because he faints at the end of it.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's tough.
Well, he weeps for them too.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
Yeah.
She says
Yeah,
something.
I guess.
Go ahead.
No, I mean it's an interesting story because, like you said, it's this sort of forbidden love that's sinful. It's not supposed to happen. They get caught up in a moment, and then they know that they shouldn't, and yet they do, and then they just give into it and give over to it. And I think it's like the passionate flame of lust, right? Like not love,
Right.
because love would be good. This is not that. It's lust, right? Lust for the flesh, for pleasure, and that pleasure overrides any sort of reason in the scenario, and that's why they're damned here this way. And I thought it was interesting when Dante said he wept for them, but I guess he weeps for them because it seemed to me like he wept because it doesn't quite seem so bad, right? Like, I know people who have talked, like, they had friends who, like, they cheated on their boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, right? And it's not forgivable, but it doesn't seem like you would hang them for it. You know, it's sort of like,
Yeah.
oh man, they couldn't help it. They just got caught up in the moment. You know, I feel like that's sort of the way it's treated. And maybe he's thinking of it something like that. Like they were young and they just got passionate and now they're eternally damned.
Yeah.
But it's that big that it's worse than limbo, right? It's an eternal torment. It's bad. It's hell. It's horrible, and it is bad. But he does weep for them, maybe because of some of his writing before, how it was sort of given over to pleasure and flesh and sexuality, right?
Mm-hmm. From what I've understood, I mean, I haven't read any of it, so I don't want to slander him, but I've heard people talk about it like that.
Yeah, but maybe it's because they're young though too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
or at least seeming right. Maybe that's one of the reasons he weeps for them. But
yeah. Well, and it does seem, yeah. I also think it's interesting that he, as a writer and an author of love poetry, chooses one of what is certainly recognized as one of the most like influential, beautiful love poetry out there, which is the Arthurian legends and all of that, as like the reason that they fall to sin. I think that's super interesting of Dante to do as a meta reflection on himself. You know, having written this kind of work, and as far as I remember, I could be wrong, but I don't think there's that much that's like explicitly sinful about like the tale of Lancelot or anything. But it's just their like experience of it that kind of is the last cat. I mean, I'm sure there's other stuff going on under the surface before they read this book together, but like,
yeah,
it's the last catalyst that pushes them over into the actual sin, which is going to condemn them. So I wonder if that also has to play into Dante's misery on their behalf.
yeah,
Maybe even having played into it somewhat himself. I don't know. He doesn't talk. He doesn't say that, but it's an interesting idea.
yeah.
It does also make me think about, like, if the tale of Lancelot is something that can seduce someone into sin, like, what about? There's so much stuff that we consume nowadays that we don't think about.
Yeah,
And you gotta wonder how much that stuff's affecting you.
yeah,
On a daily
definitely,
basis.
definitely. All right, what else do you have for 5? It's actually relatively short. I think it's only like three or 4 pages for me. It's a
Yeah.
relatively short one.
I mean, most of them have been relatively short. But yeah, this one's pretty quick. Let's see. Did I have any other notes on this? Oh, this isn't. I don't really. It's not like a talking point per se, but I just like that line. Well, I do have actually one idea about it. 121. It says, "There is no greater sorrow than to be mindful of the happy time and misery that thy teacher knows," which obviously calls back to limbo of like knowing that there's like something out there that they can't have. You know. Um, Which is interesting. Like for me, nowadays when I'm going through hard times, actually remembering the happy times helps. But I think it's only because I know that that can happen again. Whereas like here, there's none of that. There's no future return to it.
Yeah,
That's kind of all I had on this. I think. Oh, and then you did say something early at the beginning about maybe not having grasped why this is like the outermost. I think part of it certainly is that it isn't. This doesn't seem as bad as the ones later on, like you were talking about. But one thing this is not my original thought. This is something that I came across just in research. The first 3 or 4 circles, I can't remember, are what are referred to as sins of incontinence, which is like you like inordinate appetites, basically. Like there's things that are good that you're desiring, and like what you actually want is good, but you just kind of like either have too much of it or you settle for something that's like lesser than the ultimate thing that you actually want. So it's like it's not so bad as doing evil for the sake of evil, or doing evil for the sake of personal gain or whatever. It's more of like a it's more like a lack of willpower or a or an inordinate desire. And I think Dante thinks of those as lesser sins than like some of the stuff we get into once we pass into the city of Dis and stuff later on.
Definitely.
But yeah, that's all I had on that one.
Cool. And then the last few lines, Dante faints because he's so sad. And then we go into Canto 6, which is the third ring.
Yes, the circle of gluttony.
Yeah.
Very political. I didn't expect that really out of this one.
Yeah.
Like the entire second half of this one, I had to do like a lot of research to figure out what was going on, and I don't know that it was that relevant to me once I found out. But it was interesting anyway.
So he meets, upon entering this ring, he meets Cerberus, the three-headed dog.
Yes. Who is
The
also
wolf.
in Virgil's treatment of Hades in the Aeneid.
Mm-hmm. And he also paints very vivid images of what this circle looks like this black, mucky soot and hail and snow that's just falling and covering the ground and just disgusting, sloppy.
It's again very like in keeping with sort of like common imagery about gluttony. It like has that kind of like idea of like pigs wallowing around in just this like outside muck of grossness.
He says the downpour makes the spirits yowl like dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, that's pretty rough.
And they're punished by a dog thing too, which is interesting.
Yeah.
He uses those two together.
And I thought that was interesting too because, I guess there's a lot of reasons, but part of the sin is that Cerberus is like eternally tearing the flesh from their body.
Yeah.
He's like eating, like they're being consumed forever.
And they're like trying to hide in the mud to get away from him, which is like even grosser.
It is. And it's very clear to see that, they're being consumed forever because they were consuming forever,
right?
Yeah.
Contrapasso is back once again.
And it's such a visceral image too. It's not like it's rough. Yeah. It's the first time I ever read the Divine Comedy was in class, and I hadn't really read much before it, honestly. But I read this canto, and this was the first one that really shook me.
Yeah.
Because it's after lust.
Super interesting placement. I was gonna bring that up if you didn't.
Yeah. And it's the punishment is horrible, and it's visceral, and it's disgusting, and it's painful, eternal.
Probably worse than the last one, I would say. I'd rather be in the circle of love definitely than in this one.
It is worse. And the sin is gluttony.
Yeah.
Right? And in my head, like in the class I was in, there was a couple of fat people, right?
Yeah.
And you don't get fat by not eating, right?
So it's right.
Sin, right? But it's something that we glaze over.
Oh yeah.
Especially as Christians, very easily. We're like, what? Like it's just not a big deal, even though you wear that sin so clearly, And Dante puts it after lust,
which is crazy too, because the case study that he uses for lust is not even like somebody alone like lusting after somebody. It's like relationship, household ruining, like destruction of entire lives level lust. Like we're talking two people related by marriage cheating on their spouses with each other. Like, that seems pretty bad. Like, as far as like lust goes, you can come up with scenarios of lust that don't seem as bad as that.
Yes. And then Dante's like, gluttony's worse.
Gluttony's worse. Yeah.
Yeah. And it bothered me because it made me think, like, man, I don't ever try to help people with that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's like it was damning to me because I've become okay with that. Like seeing it and just not addressing it.
Yeah.
And he says it's arguably worse than lust, right? And that was just kind of hit me because I was like, man, those people might these people are suffering eternally.
These people, yeah. Ugh,
Rough.
that is tough. It does seem like, well, and I think maybe we'll find the explanation for why Dante puts it after lust um in the political section of the chapter. This is not a note I have. I'm just kind of shooting off the hip here. But so like I would my idea for why like lust would maybe be conceived of as worse is it's like ruining households and relationships and stuff. Whereas like the way that I think of gluttony right now, it's just kind of like bad for you, right? You're gonna have a less lifespan. You're gonna whatever. You're taking too much. But if you think about it in a political sense, especially in a time like Dante's living in, where resource scarcity is much more of a real thing than it is now, um, I think so. I looked into Chiaco, who we'll get into later, but he's the guy from this circle that he talks to, and I think the idea is that we don't have very much like documentation to suggest much about him. But based on the context of this, it seems like he's some sort of politician or big guy in Florence. Big guy, no pun intended. But and so I think the idea, and of course Florence and most of Italy in this period of time is like a oligarchy, right? So you have like the wealthy people ruling the like the lower classes. And so maybe the idea is that in being gluttonous, taking advantage of the opportunity he has as a wealthy person to just consume and consume and consume, he's taking away alms for people who are starving. Like that might be part of the idea of it, which would definitely make the sin more expansive even than lust, which in the past in the chapter we saw ruined households and lives and such.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And I think one of the other things with gluttony is like it's the same thing you're saying, but like if you take it to an individual's level, you are consuming more than you need, and we all know that there are people who do need.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like your neglect for people and children who are suffering and could use food while you just consume it's vast because there's so much need and we know that, right? So that definitely seems like it could be it like you're saying it covers a much bigger area.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder how far we should take this in application, right? Because like maybe the most intense interpretation of that would be something like take only what you need ever and never indulge in anything. But like then we see Jesus in the Gospels going to parties and stuff for weddings and things like this. So it's like, okay, so there are some occasions when maybe you can have more than is like strictly necessary, but then you got to find that line somehow, and I don't know exactly where to find it.
Well, I think that's true, but I think it's simpler than that too, because like if you look at morbidly obese people, like you know how hard it is to do that if you were trying to do it.
Yeah, it is that.
Like for you or me to do that,
Yeah,
it would be really hard for me to put on that weight. Like I would have to eat a lot, and I would have to do it multiple hours of the day.
Yeah,
every day for years.
Right. And how often is gluttony also paired with sloth, right? Like just because it would certainly help if you were trying to reach those levels of weight. It would certainly help if you also did nothing but eat.
Yeah. And sleep maybe.
Yeah, maybe sleep.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean that seems like that's why it's so bad because just you could say the same thing where like maybe we should all eat a little less and maybe give a little more, except for sometimes, like finding that fine line, which is probably true. But then there are people who never do that.
Right.
And only ever eat more than they can every moment they can.
Yeah.
With absolute no thought about those suffering and dying and starving.
Mm-hmm.
Just constantly consuming, basically,
yeah.
right? And that's a different level to that sin. That's a different level of neglect for themselves, but also selfishness and neglect for people around them. I mean, even if you think about like the financial toll that takes.
Sure, yeah.
Like there's so much money involved with that. Like it's expensive to eat.
Yeah.
And to eat more than you can, like to eat enough where you can put on hundreds and hundreds of pounds, is expensive.
Right.
That's an expensive feat. It's not just like you can do that with McDonald's. Like you can't even do that.
Yeah.
Like crackheads eat McDonald's exclusively, and they're very skinny.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not like you have to constantly be consuming.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it does rob, and the thing is too, I think we often in our Western culture at the moment think about certain sins as like personal in consequence, like, oh, they're not hurting anybody. You've heard this language before, probably, especially around the discussion of like homosexuality and marriage and stuff.
Yeah.
But like you really have to, if you really play out the consequences, like let's say I decided, right now I'm going to start eating way more than I need every time. I'm going to get super obese. And like, if I really play out the consequences of that in my head, now when I have kids, I'm not going to live as long for them. When I have a wife, I'm not going to be around to provide for her as much. When I have money, I'm not going to be able to spend as much of it on providing for them. When, like, there's so many like rippling effects of that decision that I wouldn't think about, like that you don't think about necessarily on the surface. But if you even just spend a minute or two considering what it could do, it's like it actually does affect a lot of people, not just you. And even if it affected just you, I think that'd be enough for it to be bad. But the fact that it also affects however many other people and has all these rippling effects that you'll never, so many that you'll never even know probably how many there are.
Because it also, a lot of these sins too become the way that these people structure their lives too, right? So if you're just constantly consuming, it becomes the way that you structure your life. And maybe that's why he brings that into the political sphere as well, because these people who are structuring their lives around consuming and eating more than they can are also putting things into effect in the land because of their roles that allow them to keep doing that. That's the way they participate in society.
Yeah.
And the roles that have in society make that really bad for everyone else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, it is you have got an excellent point though. It's one of those sins that nobody talks about. Like, I feel like if I were to choose a sin that's like probably most prevalent in our society, it's probably lust because of the tools that we have access to facilitate that. But at the same time, a lot of like it gets talked about a fair amount, at least in the circles that I run in. Like it gets a decent amount of attention. Certainly from among people who are like trying to avoid it, it's certainly something that comes up a lot. Gluttony is probably number 2, and it never gets talked about. I don't know if I've heard anybody talk about it. Maybe once in my entire life in church, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know that I ever have.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's probably number 2 out of like American sins, if we want to put it in that term.
And I'd venture to say that the sins of gluttony are also of overconsumption of things that give you pleasure as well, right?
Yeah,
so that's
probably.
like any sort of drug or alcohol that you stack on to the amount of things you can consume.
Yeah.
Unnecessarily. And even still, you don't hear it talked about that much.
Right. I wonder if you could apply gluttony to sort of our consumption of media as well. We talked a little bit about that in the last one with Lancelot and everything, but like I think we've talked about before how we have so much access to input And a lot of times that gets talked about in the context of like pornography or whatever. But if you just like look at even stuff that's probably good for you to listen to or watch, like I don't know, I listen to all sorts of podcasts and music and everything. But like eventually you have to output. Like you can't just consume and consume and consume. Like there's got to be like that has to profit for something. There has to be like in the same way that food is supposed to provide you with nutrients to output as energy. Like surely this consumption of media that we're taking part in has to eventually go out somewhere in some useful form. And I think we are often,
I think that's a great point.
yeah,
Like, because the level at which we consume media is like you have to be slothfully, and it is almost gluttonous.
yeah,
And I think, like you're saying, it's almost to a sinful degree that we're not even productive anymore. We never mind help ourselves. Never mind help the world. We can't even help ourselves. We can't. We
right.
can't be healthy. We can't be active. We can't do as much as we could. And we're definitely not helping the world to the degree that we could if we spend even half the time producing any sort of good that we do, consuming, constantly consuming. Because that is the sin. The sin is consuming.
Yeah. Which is
Yeah,
obviously
it's a
most
great.
literally represented by eating, but yeah, I think there's definitely other things that we do, certainly in our culture, that would fall into that category.
Absolutely. Oh, also, I think my phone is. Let's see. I'm at 4%,
Okay.
so I might get like I don't know, like 5 more minutes, maybe 10 out of it, maybe 10, maybe
All
10
right.
more minutes.
Let me throw one more thing out here. I think we can probably
Yeah.
glaze past a little bit of the like Florentine politics here. There's some things that I learned, but I don't know that they're like super interesting to like just talk about. They were interesting to learn, but I don't know that we like need to go over kind of all the predictions Chiaco makes about what's going to happen in Florence and whatnot.
Yeah.
Unless you had specific comments on that. Okay.
I
Good.
mean, if you have anything that you think is significant to Inferno, then definitely bring it up.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I'm probably just missing things, but I didn't see much. There's a lot about like a civil war and who's getting exiled and who from Florence ends up in hell and stuff, which I don't know. If we only have 5 minutes, I want to spend it on this here. I think it's super interesting. So Cerberus, right, as a figure in the Aeneid, the way that they get past him is they feed him like cakes, like honeyed cakes or whatever, something like that, and that occupies all of his heads, and so they manage to like slip past him. What I think is super
Yeah.
interesting here is Virgil, who wrote that occurrence, now feeds him with this like muck, slime, whatever collection of precipitation that's fallen on the ground. And I think it's super. It reminded me. I guess I'm going to become the C.S. Lewis guy this time, but it reminded me of another C.S. Lewis quote where he says, "It would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased." And I think this really speaks to that. It's like at a certain point you go so far into gluttony that it doesn't matter the quality of what you're having anymore. It's just satisfying the desire. It's just staving off the appetite a little bit. Doesn't matter what it is. It could be honeyed cakes or it could be like muddy slime. I just thought that was like
Which,
a really interesting parallel that he did there with Virgil.
which is, I think, is brilliant, and I think that is so true of what you brought up because, like, it's definitely we can see that in food, but it's also the case in media consumption.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there was a point where, like, I probably only would have wanted to watch good movies that were beautifully made with, great detail. And then I also will catch myself scrolling for 20 minutes.
Yeah, I was just about to
It's
say.
nonsense,
Instagram
you
and
know?
YouTube Shorts are definitely the analogy for the slimy muck.
It is. And it's deplorable,
It is.
And I'm trying to get away from it because I think that's definitely something I participate in. But it is. It's gluttonous and it's grotesque.
Yeah.
And it's not talked about, and it's so disgusting,
So
right? And it is that analogy to a T. Like it starts to not even matter what you're consuming; you just need to consume.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
No, that's definitely accurate. And I think and again, just like we talked about with the lust one, I think most people know that, you know, like you'd find, again, I think you'd be hard pressed to find too many people that spent the last 2 hours scrolling on Instagram, and then if you ask them like, hey, was that a good idea? They most people aren't going to say yes, that like that was like the best use of their time, or that it really
Unless they're like seriously addicted, then they
yeah,
might try to.
maybe some
But
serious addict would try to defend it somehow, but it'd be rare, you know, to find that. And so it's like we know the things that we're participating in that aren't good or profitable for us or anybody, but like we just do it anyway. It's that goes back to that Paul quote, you know, I do what I would will not to do, and what I would will to do, I don't do. So true. So stinking true.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, lots of good stuff in the Inferno. I would say I'm loving it so far. It's pretty terrible to read, but I think it's very good. Good. It's good to read, but it's not easy reading, not light reading before bed. You know.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Thanks. Yeah.
unless
So
you have
7
any
through
other,
9.
what were you gonna say? Sorry.
7 through 9 is next then.
Yes, 7 through 9 is next. I guess just so that we have an outro before your phone dies here, I'll lead us out. And yeah, 7 to 9 is next, and I guess we'll catch everybody in the next one.